Hi, it's Ronald, the rules lawyer, and I'm going to share my thoughts after watching the initial flurry of videos from Wizards of the Coast about the new edition of Dungeons & Dragons coming out this year. Now, full disclosure, I am primarily a Pathfinder 2nd Edition channel, and so I'm naturally going to speak from that perspective. But many of you know that I've also been covering D&D in depth, both the new edition and also the history of the game, and I think I've proven that I have valid, thought-out opinions. I think my thoughts today will be enlightening for people who look at a critical eye at Wizards of the Coast and want more from our hobby. Particularly people who see this new edition change as the occasion to check out other systems and want to try out other systems, whatever those systems are, not necessarily Pathfinder. There's other great systems that are being initiated now. So the hype train has left the station. Wizards of the Coast has dropped several videos in a flurry covering the 3 core books that will start to be released this year, and are putting out more videos highlighting weapon masteries, feats, and new classes in the player's handbook. I've seen all the videos to date, up to and including their video on the fighter. In terms of overall changes to this edition, the details are quite sparse. However, we have seen enough, including things we've seen before these new videos, that lead me to make several observations. And here they are. My first comment is on the boycott of Wizards of the Coast that people should engage in, for which there have been reasons that have not abated. And I need to clarify that the comments I'm about to make are not necessarily directed to new people coming into the hobby. I think actually this new edition coming out this year is really exciting. The hype around it is going to mean new people joining the tabletop role-playing game hobby as a whole. What I'm about to say is more addressed to people who have seen what Wizards of the Coast has been doing over the past couple of years. So the first thing I have to say is a friendly reminder that there are reasons not to support Wizards of the Coast. Let's not be dazzled by the new shiny. Some voices that a year and a half ago were saying they were done with D&D or D&D was dead to them are building excitement now for the new edition of D&D. Now, I'm not going to call out any specific creators. Actually, I don't have any criticism towards anyone, actually. Creators need to make a living, and the fact is the algorithm wants people to support and cover the #1 role-playing game. And YouTube pays shit to creators, and so people have got to do what they got to do. The reason they have to chase the algorithm is you. Well, not you in particular, you know what I mean. The market in general continues to play in its vast majority Dungeons & Dragons. But we all should be wiser now. We should all know that it's better that we not have a single company that has a near monopoly on the hobby that feels like it can rest on its laurels and not hold itself to high standards or avoid questionable actions. So just a quick refresher. The executives of Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast are on record saying that D&D is, quote, undermonetized, unquote, and they seek to aggressively increase the profits they make from the system. That means eliminating competition, including the third-party creators who have done a lot of great work building the audience around D&D, as shown by their efforts to revoke the Open Gaming License at the start of 2023. They also sent Pinkertons after a Magic the Gathering fan whom they accidentally sent cards to. We've also had AI art scandals, and also probably concerning you and other TTRPG players the most, your pocketbook, we have seen lightning flashes of more aggressive monetization of digital tools like D&D Beyond and the 3D virtual tabletop, with the recent announcement that they are eliminating or have eliminated a la carte purchases. If you want to have a single feat or spell from a book like Tasha's Guide to Everything, for example, you can no longer pay a small amount for that one thing. You have to buy the entire book now. They definitely want to do more than this. We know this. And though we don't know how much they will try to do or think they can get away with, we are fairly certain that they want to make it more expensive to play D&D, at least with the modern conveniences we now expect of digital tools. And finally, what prompted me to say boycott Wizards of the Coast, which actually I remember was the Pinkerton scandal, but it became more urgent when they announced at the end of 2023 their plan to fire a large percentage of their workforce over the next several months. So I've been calling for the firing of Hasbro CEO Chris Cox and Wizards of the Coast president Cynthia Williams, as well as supporting the unionization of workers at Hasbro. So what this means is we should support and explore other tabletop role-playing games, not just Pathfinder, but we've also seen Daggerheart and MCDM RPG and DC20 RPG, which currently has a Kickstarter. Those have definitely been the most prominent of the new kids on the block in the RPG scene, who have been open and transparent with their player bases through their playtesting and revising process for their games. Oh, I have to answer the door. I'm back. Luckily, it wasn't the Pinkertons. The next thing I want to say is that this is 5.5 edition, which will surprise people who follow my channel. I've been asserting that it is 6th edition. Now, what has changed? Well, I think I've been consistent this entire time. The reason why I called it 6th edition was specific to the revision process of Dungeons & Dragons. I've been fighting against the decision by Wizards of the Coast to insist that the new edition be backwards compatible to 5e. Most people, when a new edition of a game comes out, switch to the new edition. I think there is not that much interest in keeping the new books compatible with subclasses from 2015. And I think there's an interest in changing some of the core rules engine to address common complaints about the system. And new third-party publishers are now experimenting with new ideas and new games that show that some D&D-isms aren't necessarily good. So I think it hobbled the entire playtest process and the discussions around the future of the game. Well, now the ink is dry. They clearly have sent these books to the presses, which are probably printing as I speak, if not already being shipped. And given the reality that in the D&D and Pathfinder communities, we are using software version naming conventions, yes, 5.5 is the natural name of this new edition. I'll open with some positives about what I see. And first, the layout looks scrumptious, in my opinion. I am usually not a visual person who prioritizes it that much, but what I've seen has been really impressive. We got a glimpse of the layout for the new backgrounds, which looks really nice. Also, Jeremy Crawford, in the long video about the player's handbook, said that the first chapter will teach all the main rules of the game. That's a direct quote. Now, we have yet to see how detailed that is. It might be better than what Pathfinder does in its player core book. It starts with an overview chapter, but the nitty-gritty of actually playing the game, summarized in 2 pages in Pathfinder, is found on pages 398 and 399 of the book, which I think it should be earlier. They're also touting a rules glossary at the back of the book, which is probably going to have key terms and rules in alphabetical order with the text laid out, which is going to be very useful. Hopefully it will take inspiration from the gloss decks, I like to call it, in Pathfinder. See, words in alphabetical order, definitions, and page references. And of course, it's definitely going to be richer in player options, more so than the current 5e Player's Handbook. It looks like they're incorporating many of the options from Xanathar's Guide to Everything, Tasha's Guide to Everything, as well as things that people who have been following the Unearthed Arcana articles will recognize. Probably the big overall news for players is that martials overall are getting a buff with the new weapon masteries, and therefore play will become more interesting and they will be less weaker than casters. But there are some shortcomings that are significant. The first that I'll cover is that we're not being told anything that will address core problems that current dungeon masters face in D&D. Jeremy Crawford, lead designer, says that they've rebuilt every monster to suit their challenge rating.
We have rebuilt every monster that was in the 2014 monster manual, striving to make it as fun as it can be, make sure it's as scary as it should be for its challenge rating.
That all sounds great, but where was the playtest for that? Did I miss a playtest? And didn't they promise us playtests? Here's a slide from Gen Con in summer 2023, where they said they would do a total of 9 articles, focus on the player's handbook, and then do at least 1 for the Dungeon Master's Guide and the Monster's Manual. Now, in retrospect, I have a theory as to why they produced this slide. They had just released playtest 6, where they essentially officially declared that a lot of the more experimental things in the first 5 articles, they were going back on. This sudden change in course, I'm not going to go into why they might have made that decision, but whatever the cause was, they were saying that the next set of articles were going to be refinements as opposed to experiments, while throwing a bone to DMs that their lives may be made easier in an undetermined future in a future article. And playtest number 6 dropped on July 2nd, 2023, or around then. And that was when there was a big drop, a precipitous drop in interest in the revision process for the new edition. These are stats from the subreddit for 1D&D and the number of comments per day. And yeah, the last gasp was that playtest, and everything after that, a lot of the excitement has quieted down. However, they do announce some improvements to the Dungeon Master's Guide, and they all sound useful. They, for one, don't open with building your own world. It's much more practical and helpful to new DMs to read how to run the game, which is now how the book starts. We also get what sounds like concrete advice, as well as examples of building adventures and your own campaign world. However, there have been some long-standing complaints, and if you've been playing, and especially if you've been running D&D for a while, you're gonna be familiar with some of the things I'm about to say. First, the chart to build creatures in the Dungeon Master's Guide currently, the chart of statistics, is not used by the developers in the monster manual. The one that says that challenge rating 1 monsters have 71 to 85 hit points. And it's also a very complex and not very helpful way to build monsters that they present in the DMG. We're not being told of an easier way to calculate and balance encounters. We're also not being told anything about magic items and whether we will at least get an optional set of prices, suggested prices for magic items, which would be very helpful to dungeon masters. Some way to make gold more interesting and exciting to find. Now, the counter argument, and probably why they did not include magic item prices in the 5e Dungeon Master's Guide, is prices make magic items less magical. However, I do think that's an overreaction to the magic marts that were prevalent in 3rd edition and probably 4th edition. Having prices for magic items does not mean that a dungeon master has to have magic marts. And in fact, we can look at the 1st edition AD&D Dungeon Master's Guide to see that, oh, we were actually given sale values for magic items for the vast majority of them. And one can hardly argue that magic items were less wondrous in the original edition. Okay, aside from prices, we haven't heard anything addressing the huge impact that some magic items can have on inexperienced dungeon masters. Like, there should be advice on how giving winged boots to your party could have a big impact on your campaign. Or maybe we should have a baseline expectation of what level player characters are expected to get magic weapons in this game, because it does have a huge effect on building encounters. Similarly, we should have concrete advice on how certain spells might create practical issues in our games too. The 1st edition Dungeon Master's Guide gave concrete advice on how to adjudicate certain spells. Now, some of it was crazy advice that sometimes pulled gotchas on players, was based on secret information, but advice it was nevertheless. It tried. Now, the fact that we have not gotten these playtests for the Dungeon Master's Guide and the Monster Manual, which is fairly certain given that it takes several months for books to be printed and shipped, I think the reason for it boils down to the fact that there is not much to playtest. They haven't planned much to improve the experience for dungeon masters. And this may partially be explained by the firings that happened in December of 2023. That meant a total of 2,000 layoffs announced in 2023, gutting 29% of Hasbro's workforce. I'm guessing they ran out of man hours they could devote to the revision project. However, the core problem was that supporting DMs in the revision was an afterthought. this new edition was hobbled by the idea of backwards compatibility, even though many people are looking for improvements in the new edition. And that informed how they approached what they called a playtest, a description that I don't share. I was critical that what they were running wasn't actually a playtest, and I have a whole playlist on my channel of videos of me covering the Unearthed Arcana articles and the surveys as they came out. But the first task of a new edition had to have been revisiting the core rules and seeing what you could change, even if it's just tweaks, little things, before you present character options. However, we saw only character options presented in the UA articles and polls, surveys that basically only asked people their level of satisfaction with this or that thing in isolation. It was more a marketing tool to generate hype among players about the new options that their characters could get, and not really to improve the engine of the game. Now, to some extent, they did gauge opinion, the surveys had some impact, but it was mainly to weed out stinkers, to kick ideas to the curb that were violently rejected by the player base. We were never presented a complete system for DMs or players to work with in draft form. But it was imperfect data and poorly designed surveys. Why am I getting into all of this? Well, this was all underscored for me when Jeremy Crawford talked about drinking potions as a bonus action, which I concede is, yes, probably good for the game overall. But we never saw this in any of the UA articles. Now, why would this be harmful? It's not necessarily bad to make new changes after your last public playtest. You want to do that based off of the feedback you get in those playtests. Other companies, including Paizo, have definitely done that. The problem I'm trying to get at is, what were we supposed to playtest at the time when we did not know that a core rule, something core to the rules, was being changed? We have been asked in every single Unearthed Arcana article to assess different character options. And one of those, in one of the earliest UA articles, was the Thief subclass for the Rogue, who had as their main ability at 3rd level fast hands to, as a bonus action, be able to use the magic action, and that includes drinking potions. Context matters, and people were being asked to give their opinion on character options without knowing the context, without knowing changes to the core rules, which were the more important thing to get feedback on and to playtest and try to revise. Instead, what we got was the design team deciding to limit what the scope of the playtest was and what this new revision could possibly change in the new edition, even though it was a change that they ended up, in this case, taking up in the end after all. And honestly, I think what happened was that after this last playtest, where this appeared in July of 2023, Baldur's Gate 3 came out, a huge success for Larian Studios and Wizards of the Coast. And drinking a potion is a bonus action in that game. And I think the popularity of that convinced the design team to make it a default feature for all players. And for people playing D&D who are first exposed to the game via Baldur's Gate 3, this prevents a feels bad moment. So now what was arguably the point of taking the Thief subclass, or the main point, now needs to be re-looked at. And we don't know what that change is. I assume we'll learn what that is in the Thief video coming up. But another thing this illustrates is that we still have the clunky bonus action system in D&D. It's confusing to veteran players of the game, and I don't think any other tabletop role-playing game has a system like this, where you have actions in 2 categories, where some bonus actions are as powerful as some actions, but you cannot exchange them for each other in any manner whatsoever. I did a video that you can see about how bonus actions were never playtested by Wizards of the Coast in the lead up to 5e. And now was the perfect time to revisit it with a new edition, but they didn't. And I suggested in that video, maybe you can have a hierarchy of actions like in 4th edition, where you can trade out a standard action for a minor action. Pretty simple, but it also would have meant revisiting features of the classes and having that established early in the revision process. And by the way, one of the things that they touted is that the adrenaline rush ability of the orc is now charged on a short rest instead of a long rest. It lets you use a bonus action to dash and gain a number of temporary hit points. However, if barbarians are, as we saw them in the most recent playtest, then they have to use a bonus action to enter rage. So if you're an orc barbarian, you have to choose between these two features, which I don't know if that's a good thing. It certainly would surprise a new player, let's say that. Another thing that shows the problem of inadequate playtesting was weapon masteries. Weapon masteries involves grouping weapons into groups, giving them special properties that martial characters who have a class feature can unlock when they use that weapon. And Jeremy Crawford talked about how much fun he was having multiple attacks as a fighter and alternating between the weapons.
I, in the playtest, spent most of my time playing a fighter, and I had a ball creating, especially as the fighter was higher level and had more and more masteries unlocked. I loved being able to play this mini game of, all right, at first I want to use this weapon because of this mastery property. Then my next attack will be this one where I can exploit what I did with the previous weapon. Super fun.
The idea of switching weapons sounds fun. You can have a weapon with a push property to strike a creature, push them back 5 feet, and then use a reach weapon, a different weapon, that has the topple property to knock them down. And then if you walk away, that monster now has to stand up and is not able to reach you and attack you in the same turn. This has been one of the most popular things in the Unearthed Arcana process. It's definitely better than what martials had before. Now, meanwhile, players were being asked what they thought of this new feature. And there's an issue when it comes to some monsters in this game that, for example, the mummy has damage resistance to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing from non-magical attacks. Now, if you have only one magic weapon, then alternating between weapons is off the table when fighting this creature. Or at least it's much less effective to switch between weapons now. But there is uncertainty in the community right now. There's been speculation over whether monsters will have this resistance in the new edition. And of course we have to speculate because we have not been given a single monster stat block for the new edition. I have never heard of a playtest of a role-playing game system that does not include monsters from that system. If monsters still have this resistance, then that absolutely will affect how you assess different weapon properties, even on an individual basis. That means that some properties like topple that are more situational, this one knocks them prone, which is only important in some situations in 5e, is going to be less universally applicable than Vex, the one that when you strike a foe successfully, your next attack against that same creature will have advantage. If you're only able to have one magical weapon, then the value of Vex relative to topple becomes much higher. And so people were being asked how to assess weapon properties and weapon masteries without enough information. And when I say every other system, I include 5e itself, which put out playtest stat blocks for people to give feedback on. So the lack of playtesting the monsters in the new monster manual tells us one of two things. Either, one, there has not been any significant changes to monsters, which is bad, or two, that there are significant changes. But those significant changes were things that we should have had at the beginning of the playtest process so that we could give proper feedback, and because that has not happened, there may be unintended consequences when everything is released together. We can just look at 5e and see the CR25 Tarask, how it does not survive contact with the enemy, or other high CR monsters that have very low saving throws that tactical players can punch through, or monsters like the dragon who have a frightful presence that has a very high DC that can shut down many martial characters. And the next one is a big one, problematic spells in 5e. In the hands of some players, some spells are pretty powerful and can lead to big challenges to dungeon masters. There's also been the complaint of casters being much more powerful than martial characters, especially as they go into mid and higher levels. Treant Monk, who has a lot of great insights about 5e, says that the martial caster divide largely is contained in a small percentage of spells. I'll let him speak for himself and play a clip.
The martial caster divide is not an issue caused by class features. It is caused by spell design. If a race car has an unfair advantage because of the rockets they attach to the back of the car, the solution isn't to pop the tires. The solution is to remove the rockets. D&D has spells that are too weak, spells that are fine, and spells that are too strong or abusable, and that final category is actually the smallest category.
He released that video in May of 2023 when he, and I think the majority of the community, were expecting a playtest focused on spells.
There are 79 pages of spells in the player's handbook. That's more pages of spells than pages of all the classes and all the subclasses in the player's handbook combined. You cannot reasonably come to the conclusion that banishment, spiritual weapon, bark skin, and some cantrips, and they're done. The spells playtest or playtests are coming. There is no doubt.
However, we now know that playtest never happened. Maybe related to the same staffing cutbacks, I don't know. And they have not said anything in the latest videos, not a word, about revisiting spells and making them more balanced, let alone more fun. Now, some detractors might say that caster players will riot if they nerf spells, certain spells, and I think they would, but I think that the majority of the player base wants the game to be healthy. And I think many dungeon masters would say, yeah, it's all right to have force cage require a saving throw and not have it automatically cage in a ancient dragon that I set up as a arch villain. I think that most players at that table would agree. And I think many caster players too would appreciate not having the ability to win a whole variety of combats with a handful of spells without much thought, creativity, or effort. And while we're at it, why not have saving throws do more scaling with level, so that an ancient red dragon, their intelligence save is not +4. Another issue that has been created in this new version of D&D is that some backgrounds now do not mesh with some classes. One of the design goals with Tasha's Guide to Everything a few years ago was to free up different combinations of race and class. Before, certain races favored certain classes because they boosted a particular ability score. They removed that and basically freed things up so that any race with any background could be any class without being penalized for those role-playing choices, let's call them. However, the new edition regresses on this front.
One of the major changes for backgrounds is exactly that they now give you an ability score bonus, or rather set of bonuses. Each background now lists 3 ability scores, and if you select that background, you then choose how you want to distribute your bonus there. So you can either have +2 in one of them and +1 in another, or you can have +1 in all 3 of them. Mm-hmm. And so you have a tremendous amount of flexibility to pair different backgrounds with different classes, because what we wanted to do is make it so that the backgrounds were as flexible as possible to support as many different character concepts as possible.
This means that if you want to have as high wisdom as possible for your cleric or your druid, you do not want to be a noble because you cannot increase your wisdom through this background.
If you really love optimizing your character, and when you choose your background, you're not just interested in its story implications, but you're really interested in how it's going to affect your ability scores. Well, knowing that there are players where that kind of optimization is important to them, the character creation chapter has a table that tells you here are the backgrounds to choose if you are looking for backgrounds that bump these certain ability scores.
That's fantastic.
Now, granted, there are rules for making custom backgrounds that will be provided in the Dungeon Master's Guide. However, that means officially you need to ask your dungeon master to create this custom background. Now, of course, every DM should probably say yes to such a request, but this obstacle did not need to be created in the first place. Other RPG systems do not make your background matter for purposes of your class, and I don't need to point to Pathfinder here. I can look at Level Up, Advanced 5th Edition. Their backgrounds gave you a +1 to one stat, a specific stat, yes, but +1 in one other ability score. So no matter what the prime ability score of your class was, the Sage background would let you increase it. Also, Tales of the Valiant, put out by Cobalt Press. They adopt the Tasha's rule that lets you add 2 to one score and 1 to another, so long as the end result is not above 18. Lastly, I just want to point to Ronald's pet peeves, some things that annoy me, that I think not just Wizards of the Coast, but other tabletop role-playing game publishers should do, but don't always do. First of all, I am happy that the 5e Dungeon Master's Guide has an index. Not all role-playing game systems have an index, and I'm glad that the new edition is going to have a rules glossary. And now in the new videos that have been put out, they praise how you know where you are in the book.
As you are looking through the player's handbook, as you're making your character, there's such intentional design behind everything. Every piece of art, the layout. I can flip through this book and in seconds know where I am.
All of those choices were very intentionally made.
However, I've been spoiled by Paizo in their books when I check out other systems and don't see the organization of the book on the side. And we got a preview of some pages from the new player's handbook here, and we have nothing of the kind here. And let me just show on the side what Pathfinder does on all of their pages. They have all the chapters laid out, and when you enter a chapter, all of the subdivisions within that chapter are laid out. So here, the chapter for playing the game, you can easily find the rules for death and dying or the list of basic actions, for example. And when you're in the spells section, we see that there are subdivisions for the alphabet, different parts of the alphabet. That is so useful. And it does not take much real estate off the page. Here's what the 2-page spread looks like. It could just be this little thing on the side. Pet peeve, but it is so, I find it very useful when you're looking for the spells chapter to just flip through the right-hand side with your thumb and see that you're making it to the spells chapter, and then you arrive. And you're looking for that spell that starts with a D, and you flip to that. My next pet peeve is in this snippet from the background, and I don't know if you can find it. You can pause the video and see if you can find it. All right, my pet peeve here is that it's pointing to not a page number, but look for the skilled feat in chapter 5. Look for gaming set in chapter 6. Like, come on, give us a page number. Now, Pathfinder doesn't always do it, but sometimes it does, and I super appreciate it. Like here in Pathfinder, this description of the treat poison action. It says you need a healer's toolkit, which can be found on this page. And I'm sure modern desktop publishing software lets you put placeholders in so that this can be automated. I don't see any reason why a publisher should not include page numbers. All right, some of my final thoughts. Basically, I think that Wizards of the Coast is resting on its laurels, confident that its #1 position, its brand recognition, the fact that its name is associated with the hobby, the way that Kleenex is associated with facial tissue, will guarantee their success in the long term. As a result, they were very conservative with this new edition, guarding their core engine, not opening the hood at all in their playtesting process, committed to not breaking backwards compatibility. And what has resulted is what some members of the D&D community are now called glorified paid errata, paying full price for a new set of books that is not a marked improvement over what existed previously. I think basically that there was a lost opportunity with this edition, and I put out this video to raise players' expectations about what to expect from their RPG publishers. And we're actually in a great time in our hobby where there's been a huge influx of new players over the last several years, and many of them have had their eyes opened that there's not only one tabletop role-playing game that exists. And there are many people who are discontented, who have been playing 5e for a while, who see some long-standing issues, who, yes, may get caught up in the hype and may buy the new books and check them out and play some sessions with them, who will be not fully satisfied, and for whom it was the last straw, not through some dramatic act by Wizards of the Coast, but by the lack of decided improvement in what they had hoped a new edition would bring. So that's it. I lastly want to point people to my friend Alan and his new RPG, DC-20, that is now being kickstarted. From what I've read, I've only looked a little into it. It looks promising, and people should check that out. I'll leave a link in the video description. I've heard it described as borrowing ideas from 5e and Pathfinder 2nd Edition, which for many people is what they want. I lastly ask you to support my Patreon. I don't make money as an attorney. For an explanation why, look up my coming out video. Also, I don't make as much as a YouTube creator because I cover a game that's not the #1 market leader. Supporting my Patreon gives you ad-free early access to most of my videos and exclusive content. Also check out my Discord. We have over 5,000 people there talking Pathfinder 2e and other role-playing games. And we have a drop-in, drop-out organized play system called Endless Tale Tavern for Pathfinder 2e, if you're interested. So that's it. I've been Ronald the Rules Lawyer. See you next time.